Thank you very much, Jamie and Mark, for inviting me to this space. Thank you, Luke, for suggesting my name after the difficulties I had last month. I haven't been able to attend the previous meetings in part because I'm 6 hours behind. So these sessions are often intertwined with the chaotic dynamics of the administrative burdens of academic life, which I am not sure that they provide any meaning, but I'm sure they reduce uncertainty and that they can be very redundant. So fortunately, I have been able to follow most of the sessions asynchronously through the YouTube channel. So I hope that following Mark commenting on chapter 1, I will redundantly go through the main contributions of the book, providing the disturbance of my particular interpretations in order to be able to participate in the discursive construction of meaning around Lutz's work that this space has allowed, in which I hope also help us, a community around Lutz's book, to foresee all the possible empirical applications of his contributions. As Lutz mentioned before, I had the chance to work under Lutz's supervision more than 10 years ago. And it's really rewarding to see some of the ideas that are echoed in my pieces in this book. So I'm very grateful to be able to comment on some of these chapters. I was able to witness the maturation and rigorous reflection on many of the main points of this book in Lutz's way, discursively engaging with peers, incursively refining his work as a result of debate and other forms of interaction. Perhaps one of the most valuable experiences that I come again and again was one particular hard review we received with Loet. I wanted to forget about it, but very patiently, as if dealing with a frustrated teenager, Loet recommended me to understand where the criticism was coming from, its points of departure, the codes of communication underlying the comments, and the possibly horizons of meaning where we would have to position our submission, and that would have to be clearly introduced and argued for the paper. And I have an extra task for Larry in his questioning what meaning means. In Spanish, meaning is also traduced as sentido, so sense. So I have always had this difficulty of thinking of meaning as something that is only significance, but it's also significance that is socially constructed. So something that perhaps we can talk about later. I was supposed to comment on chapter 2 and 3, chapters where I felt confident and at ease. Chapter 4, the calculus of redundancy, added to the philosophical richness of the previous chapters, the complexity of the mathematical formulations. As suggested at the end of the section 4.5, for the less interested, although I would argue more challenged reader, I scanned section 4.6 and went back to section 4.7 with the informed expectation that was fulfilled, that Inga would get into the more mathematical parts of the book. So thank you, Inga. So if slides mark the beginning of the formal presentation, I will start by going back to Lutz's line of argument at the end of chapter 3, where after proposing that the development of discursive knowledge results from interacting communications which are framed or conditioned, or in Lutz's words, guided by latent codes of communication, he goes further to invite the readers to question if this, and by this I mean the development of discursive knowledge, could be operationalized so that applying Shannon's information theory meaning could be measured or at least approached at. Lutz's invitation to relay the information processing calculus in Shannon's mathematical theory of communication to meaning builds on Warren Beaver's perception of the bizarreness of mathematical definitions of information, where being it expressed as uncertainty or availability of choice and options, information was not informative. The end of chapter 3 goes on with the possibilities to bridge meaning and information processing, building on Luhmann's social system and its implications on meaning, as I read it, as an emergent property of a social system, and Shannon's mathematical theory of communication. Luet relies on Herbert Simon's contribution on horizontal and vertical possibilities of differentiation on complex systems as the foundations for bridging Shannon and Luhmann, so that meaning could perhaps be subject to a mathematical formulation and therefore measurement. Herbert Simon's model of complex systems argues for evolution as the triggering dynamics of complex hierarchies where subsystems behave as stepping stones that allow for the emergence of larger, more complex functional systems. The intensity of the interactions motivates differentiation, but in a way that, and I quote Simon, those loose horizontal couplings of the components of a hierarchic system permit each to operate dynamically in independence to the detail of the other. Only the input it requires and the output it produces are relevant for the larger aspects of systems behavior. I will skip a bit, relying on Inga and Mark's commentaries, because I wish to include in my commentary some possibilities on empirical applications of these contributions based on the work we collaborated upon with Lucio so many years ago, and that the reading of this book inspires me to dream on. So I will go directly to figure 4.4, in which Luet builds on previously aggregation made by Warren Beaver on the original model of communication proposed by Claude Shannon in 1949. I borrow figure 4.4 in Luet's book to synthesize the different dynamics, sup and supra, involving the communication. The original model, which you find in black, represents the communication of information from a sender to receiver. Here again, information is defined as the uncertainty contained in the probability distributions. Reflexivity of scientific discourse implies a selection of Shannon type information. This reflexivity implies a selection of Shannon type information when a scientist submits a contribution and when its knowledge claim is validated through the peer review operation of the first and second selection mechanisms, variation is introduced in the system. This variation can be expected to increase uncertainty in the system. The operation of the codes of communication in a next order dynamics potentially reduces this uncertainty by structuring the variation in terms of the codes of communication. This leads us to the mechanisms of growth and change that are thus given by the discursiveness underlying this process of knowledge generation, validation, reflexive utilization in the production of new knowledge claims by citations. The historical origin of the variation may become less visible as a series of selections that rewrite the past, as Luet claims in the book. We tried to see if perhaps we could work with this concept in our specific case of study when I did my PhD thesis. I started my PhD in 2006 when some had been manifesting that the technology hype around the nanotechnological promise had reached its peak of inflated expectation and was in a long valley of disillusionment. As a scientific knowledge-based innovation, we agreed that nanoscience provide an interesting case to explore these disturbances or interactions among three orthogonal but mutually disturbing subsystems: the system of scientific knowledge production, the economic systems, and perhaps a third system of policymaking. But as my background, although I'm an economist, was more in bibliometrics, we concentrated on the system of scientific knowledge production and reflected on how we could operationalize this system to understand its discursiveness and how it could be understood as a system reproducing itself in the continuity of the communicative interactions, in the incessant chattering of text, as Blaise Cronin put it in 2006. And this relates again to the operation of the three levels of information meaning processing that I briefly illustrated in two previous slides, and that refer to the reflexivity of scientific discourse. A publication can be thought of as a manifestation of this communication, of this variation at the present. But this publication provides variation referring to some horizons of meaning, codifying this variation in terms of citations in relations to other texts. But it's also positioned as an event in relation to other publications around the time axis. It co-occurs with other sources of variance in an academic journal. And this publication can also be repositioned when knowledge content of the publication is interpreted and incorporated in new knowledge claims in further publications, when it gets cited, when it's reflexively selected to reinforce the generation of new knowledge claims. We tested how this reflexive reposition of the publication could in fact reflect on the historical origins becoming overridden or less visible. And for this, we use the concept of main path analysis from network theory. In bibliometrics and scientometrics, the main path has been regarded as the structural backbone of a field of research. The main path highlights those nodes, in this case papers, that have the most relevance in terms of inlinks and outlinks, in terms of citing and being cited. We applied the concept of critical transitions as those in-between points where information, again, Shannon type information, distance was shortened. Complex systems evolve following paths determined by previous states of the system. However, an evolving system can also be expected to forget parts of its history from the perspective of hindsight. We interpreted critical transition as an indicator of these processes of forgetting, rewriting, and perhaps bifurcating paths. Sorry. This relates to Loet's figure 4.3, where a three-dimensional array of information can contain a trajectory. A four-dimensional hypercube contains one more degree of freedom and thus a variety of possible trajectories. We did apply a configurational information measure to see if synergy at the system levels could be indicated as a reduction of uncertainty between the distribution of cited references and titled words in publication years. At that moment, the notion of redundancy as an indicator of and possibility of meaning processes underlying these distributions or these discursive interactions was still immature in its mind, and I wanted to go home. It's funny how when you get eager to finish your PhD and then regret not prolonging some of the best years of your life. So we did test this these distributions of title words that provided variation with cited references that provided like those codification or codes of communication. And we did it for the case of nanoscience, particularly nanotubes and fullerenes. And we found that in nanotubes, that was a very dynamic research front in 2006. We found that there was diminishing or reducing configurational information, while in fullerenes that was not as popular and that had lost its interest, there was, again, more noise, more Shannon type information. And with this, I finish my presentation.